For the pro-Hamas Nazi American media, not all civilians are alike, as I posted this morning. The Sunday show hosts expressed their displeasure with Israel defending itself, insisting that Israel is not doing enough and must do more to protect civilians. Of course, not one of them explains how Israel is to fight upwards of 50,000 Palestinian terrorists in Gaza, many of whom have moved to South Gaza and, as is known to all, use the civilians to protect themselves. 50,000 terrorists. It's relevant and important to note that not one of these Sunday hosts has ever expressed this kind of concern about the slaughter of civilians in Iran, which is ongoing, or the slaughter of civilians in China, which is ongoing, the slaughter of civilians in Syria, which is ongoing, and so forth and so on. There's something horribly immoral about the American media and how they report with self-righteous indignation their supposed concern for civilian deaths, but only the collateral deaths of civilians in Gaza that Israel is trying, like no other military on the planet, to avoid. That's certainly not the case with any terrorist group or state like Hamas and Iran, among numerous others, who slaughter their own civilians in order to stay in power and impose their Islamist ideology, and target and slaughter civilians in Israel, Yemen, and anywhere else where they think they can achieve their Islamist objectives. But it's time to face facts, America. For the Marxists and the Islamists, of course, for the American media, for the Democrat Party, for the Biden regime, they are using civilian deaths as a weapon against Israel, just as Hamas intended, while they ignore all the purposeful, targeted, and mass slaughter of civilians taking place throughout the globe. Only Israel faces relentless media attention and condemnation, because the media and the Democrat Party and the Biden regime are as anti-Semitic as our colleges and universities and the Islamist front groups funded and networked in our own country that feed them this data. And they do not want Israel to defeat Hamas, because the Jewish lives in Israel are simply not important enough for the Marxist ideology to reign, for the Biden-Blinken foreign policy to continue, and for the contemptible, unconscionable American media that supports all of it. All of it. What about the civilians, they keep asking the Israelis? What about the civilians? What about them? What about them? It's a fair question. Who are these civilians? Who are these civilians? Oh, they're Palestinians. Okay. The media keep telling us a fiction, that there's a huge difference between Hamas, Palestinian terrorists, and the Palestinian population. This is what they keep telling us. Is it true? And if it's true, based on what? A couple of interviews? No, it's a lie, actually. There's almost no daylight between the Palestinian terrorists who call themselves Hamas and the Palestinian citizens in the Gaza Strip and in Judea and Samaria. We know this as a matter of fact. And I've pointed out to you in the past reports that have been done, polls and surveys that have been conducted, that tell us exactly this, that 85%, let me read this to you, from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, although they didn't conduct the poll or the survey, Assuming my computer plays along here, Mr. Producer, which of course it won't. Here we are. A new poll, this came out about 10 days ago. I mentioned it in passing. Supporting terror and rejecting peace. That's the Palestinians. The results of a new market research conducted by the Arab World for Research and Development, AWRAD, and I mentioned this as I say, but I want to underscore it. Among Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, give a penetrating insight into the mindset of the Palestinians, writes the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, a think tank. Now, you'll note that most of this has been ignored by most of the American media because they want their narrative to continue. The results of new market research: for over 3 decades, the international community has supported both the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. The results of the survey show that Palestinians overwhelmingly support terrorism, reject peace, and are fundamentally ungrateful towards the countries that have supported and funded them. The Palestinian attitudes reflected in the survey do not grow in a vacuum. Instead, they are representative of the complete adoption of the constant and poisonous message of the Palestinian Authority. They are an accurate, albeit bleak and painful reflection of the total implosion of the so-called Oslo paradigm. That was the first peace in our time deal involving Rabin and the other leftists. If the international community truly seeks peace in the Middle East and a brighter future for all its residents, policies must change and a new paradigm must be adopted. Now let's take a look at some of these results. Palestinians support terror, reject peace, and deny Israel's right to exist. When taken as a whole, the results indicate that an overwhelming percentage of the Palestinians support the October 7 massacre, 75%. Reject coexistence with Israel, 86%. Are committed to the restoration of, quote-unquote, historic Palestine as a final solution, 71%. And support the creation of a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, in other words, the obliteration of the Jews, 75%. As the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Interestingly, there's more support for the October 7 massacre from the Palestinian residents in Judea, Samaria, 83%, than those in the Gaza Strip, 64%. Support for terror organizations. The Palestinian positive perception of the terror organizations remains high, despite their role in carrying out the massacre and the disastrous results. Breaking down the response. How come none of the Sunday shows did this, Mr. Producer? How come Jake Tapper has completely ignored this? How come Wolf Blitzer has? How come Joe Scarba and Mika Brzezinski have ignored this? Andrea Mitchell? How about all the reprobates on MSNBC and CNN? Not one of them. Because they push a fiction. It's the Jews. We get this from Muslims on these networks. We get this from atheists on these networks. We get this from Democrats on these networks, all of whom really are Democrats. We get this from self-hating Jews on these networks. Their hate for Jews and their support for anti-Semitism is quite diverse. They've struck the diversity chord. Breaking down the response, 76% believe that Hamas plays a somewhat to very positive role. 84% believe Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that's the Muslim Brotherhood, plays a somewhat to very positive role. 80% believe that Fatah's terror wing, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, plays a somewhat to very positive role. And 89%, 9 out of 10, believe that Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades, plays a somewhat to very positive function. Does this sound like people who want to live in peace? A brand new country? Does it? Palestinians hold fundamentally racist views. Looking at this survey, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs declares correctly, and I dare Jake Tapper to take this information with graphs and present it. I dare Wolf Blitzer to do it. I dare Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski to do it. I dare them all. All of them. When asked about U.S. and Western support for Israel against the terrorists, 91.5% agreed with the attitude that the support is the result of the, quote, influence of the Israeli lobby. The Jews are behind it. 85.5% agreed that the support is the result of, quote, hatred of Arabs, unquote. You know, it's interesting. A majority of the Israeli Arabs support Israel in this war, and many of them are fighting in this war. I guess it depends what Arabs you ask. 79.5% agreed with the belief that the support for Israel is the result of hatred of Muslims in Islam. The brainwashing and indoctrination is going well, hasn't it? But don't worry, Blinken and Biden have a solution. Take Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, and give it to the Palestinians. Because they're different than Hamas. Hamas is Palestinian. The Islamic Jihad of Palestine is Palestinian. The PLO is Palestinian. The Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, they are Palestinian. Alongside the disdain for the U.S. and Western countries, the Palestinians also believe that moderate Arab countries also play a negative role. According to these Palestinians who were surveyed, the United Arab Emirates plays the most negative role, 96%, followed by Saudi Arabia, 95.5%, Egypt, 84.6%, and Jordan, 75.6%. All these countries have made peace with Israel or consider the possibility. While support for terror organizations is high, over 87%, the Palestinians believe that the Palestinian Authority plays a negative role. Only 23% believe that Fatah plays a positive role when asked who should govern the Gaza Strip and the areas in Judea and Samaria that are under the control of the Palestinian Authority. 8.4% support the Palestinian Authority. In comparison, 85.8% supported Hamas, continuing to play a role in the Palestinian government. What do you think of that, folks? These are the obviously moderate and peaceful Palestinians. And they conclude, when asked who would emerge victorious from this war, 72.6% said Palestine would. 74.3% expect the war to end with a Palestinian victory that, quote, achieves the liberation of Gaza from the Israeli invasion, unquote. Gaza was never Palestinian, not by any argumentation, no matter how spun. Nobody occupies it but the Palestinians. So when you're talking about 90%, 88%, 84%, at lowest 79%, ladies and gentlemen, there's almost no difference between the Hamas Palestinian terrorists and the Palestinian population. I'm not talking about all Palestinians all over the world. I'm talking about Palestinians in the Middle East. And now you know why Rashida Tlaib, is who she is. Between her ears, I'm talking about. Because this is the kind of poison, cancerous, barbaric hate that's been passed down to her. But these are the facts. And it's funny how CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the outlets that reach most of the people have killed this. They've smothered it with a pillow. What about the Palestinian civilians? I don't know. How many of them have been mass raped? I'm going to get into this. How many of them have been decapitated? How many of them have been burned by motorcycle fumes and been tattooed?